The minimum wage has been a big topic in Canada over the past couple months, and that's largely because there's been increases across the country. So there's been an increase in Alberta and one in Ontario as well, where the increase or the minimum wage has now gone to $14 an hour and is going to $15 an hour starting next year. Now, it may surprise you to find out that the media creates their own narratives, and there's been a narrative that's been created around this increase on the minimum wage as well. And of course, that narrative is focused on business interests over the interests of labor unions or the workers. So, Press Progress has a recent report that actually looked into how the media in Canada has covered the minimum wage increase. So, here's what they say. 3/4 of all news coverage, 75% between December 31st, 2017 and January 4th, 2018, greeting the new minimum wage, including news reports, opinion columns, and editorials, directly quoted or cited figures from business owners, bankers, and corporate lobbyist groups. While fewer than 1/3 of all news articles, 32%, cited sources like unions, labor economists, or even the low-wage workers impacted by the minimum wage raise themselves. Now, if you're an American, this story wouldn't be all that surprising. I think there already is a general consensus in the US that the mainstream media, or the mass media as a whole, focuses on business interests over the interests of the average worker. But in Canada, this hasn't been an issue that's really been looked at all that much. So I'm going to show you some headlines here that, or partially that Press Progress also gave examples of, but headlines that show just how the minimum wage raise was covered. Here's a headline from the Globe and Mail. Small business owners brace for impact as Ontario minimum wage hike takes effect. Now, what I find so crazy about this headline is that look at the framing, the built-in assumption here. Small business owners brace for impact. Almost like they're talking about all small businesses. All small business owners are bracing for impact because of the new minimum wage. But here's the reality. In fact, although there's around 400,000 small businesses in Ontario, reporters only got in touch with 14 of them. One of the most mentioned businesses, a Toronto area restaurant called Kaboom Chicken, was cited by the Canadian Press and the Globe and Mail because the restaurant criticized minimum wage hikes on Instagram. So this is something I catch the media doing often, whether it's here or in the US. There'll be certain businesses that are public about their political positions, public about it on social media. And then media outlets will go running to them and get their opinion and act like they are representative of the entire industry or whatever sector they're representing. So that's what they did here. While there's, around 400,000 small businesses in Ontario, the reports on the minimum wage only touched on 14 of them and went to places like Kaboom Chicken, which was outwardly criticizing the minimum wage hike. Now, here's another example. So this was a number that this was a story that I did a video on already that I'll link to maybe above right now, where there's after the minimum wage increase, there was this hyper focus on the number 60,000 job losses. So here's an example of that. CBC News Business. Minimum wage hikes could cost Canada's economy 60,000 jobs by 2019. Now, I'm not going to rehash the entire video that I did on this topic already, but essentially it boils down to there really isn't much data behind that 60,000 jobs number. And in fact, history shows us when there's been a minimum wage increase, there really hasn't been much of an impact on job losses. So once again, there's this hyper focus and fear mongering on looking at business interests over the interests of the vast majority of people, the actual workers of these businesses. And so here's another headline, this one from Financial Post. Ontario's minimum wage hike off to rocky start as employers slash hours, benefits to compensate. Now, this is another example of look at how they frame the headline and where the blame is being put. So here, Ontario's minimum wage hike off to rocky start as employer/hours benefits. The built-in assumption of the blame here is on the minimum wage, instead of the focus being on why can't these businesses properly pay their employers an actual living wage or a wage that is closer to a living wage. So why does the fault fall on the minimum wage increase instead of on the businesses that don't know how to handle it for whatever reason? Maybe their prices on goods are too low, or maybe the executives in these companies are making too much money. But no, the focus is on the minimum wage itself. That here is the focus of the issue, rather than looking at the individual businesses that are having the problem with the increase. So again, this was the majority of the headlines that we saw, and there's more here. Despite a body of credible research from academic sources showing minimum wage increases have clear economic benefits and 53 Canadian economists endorsing the policy, half of all news articles, 50%, fail to list any economic benefits whatsoever from raising the minimum wage. So despite the body of research showing the benefits of raising the minimum wage and 53 Canadian economists endorsing it, half of the articles fail to even mention any benefits of raising the minimum wage. Once again, showing that there is a hyper-focus on business interests over anything else. And quoting Press Progress, more than half of all news articles, 53% reviewed by Press Progress, cast businesses as the victims of the story, frequently highlighting ways businesses will struggle as a result of raising the minimum wage. By contrast, only 14% of all news articles highlighted ways low-wage workers are already struggling to make ends meet. Now, while I've been highlighting how the media has failed on this topic, I do also want to point out the stories that did actually show the minimum wage increase in a positive light, ones that actually got the story correct. So here's an example from HuffPost where a Forum Research poll showed that 2/3 of voters support the increase in Ontario. So while the vast majority of voters supported the increase, that wasn't shown in the media coverage of it. So if you have 2/3 of the population supporting a policy, yet 75% of the coverage of that policy is in the opposite direction, it shows you that the media is not representing the people. The media is representing business interests. So here's another example of a positive example of how the minimum wage was covered. So the Globe and Mail had this article: Alberta hasn't suffered for raising the minimum wage. In the year preceding November 2017, the latest available data, Alberta's service sector added 12,400 jobs as part of our province's economic recovery. In 2016, while Alberta's economy was still in recession, our service sector added 26,500 jobs. These jobs were created despite Alberta's minimum wage increasing 33% in 2015 to 17. This reality follows smaller but still significant minimum wage increases in Alberta in 2007, 14%, in Quebec in 2010, 12%, and in British Columbia in 2011 to 2012, 28%. None of these cases resulted in major job losses. So recent history shows that there has not been a negative impact on jobs due to the increase in the minimum wage. And Alberta actually has a labor shortage at the low end of the wage scale that is likely to continue for the next couple of years. A higher minimum wage will make these jobs more attractive. There are, in fact, many benefits to raising the minimum wage. A minimum wage increase is, in effect, a stimulus to the local economy because low-income earners spend most of their income, and chiefly in their community. Raising the minimum wage increases overall consumer spending power and the amount of money circulating in our economy. So Alberta actually has a labor shortage at the low end of the wage scale. So I imagine that the new minimum wage increase is going to help with that. Now, the other part of what they say here, to me, is sort of obvious. But to a lot of people, it's not. So when low-wage earners begin to make more money after a minimum wage increase, for example, they put that money back into the local economy because they actually need to spend money. Because poor people don't have a lot of money. So when they get new money, they spend it. To me, this is obvious. So that should make sense to you compared to somebody who is wealthy and doesn't need the increase in wealth. When they get new money, it goes back into the bank, or maybe they spend it on a trip in a different country. But it's less likely to go back into the local economy. But when low-wage earners get it, and there's a lot more low-wage earners than there are wealthy people, that money actually goes back into the local economy. So there is always going to be this narrative this narrative of corporate interests over anything else. And that's because these corporations or even neoliberal think tanks, they have a hold on the media. They push certain narratives. They're able to organize and push their ideas out there on the media. Whereas unless you're in a union, and not everybody is, most people aren't, unless you're in a union, your ideas aren't necessarily being pushed on the media. So that's why we see 75% of news articles in the interests of business interests as opposed to the interests of the vast majority of people. As I showed you, the majority of people in Ontario, despite all the negative headlines, support the minimum wage increase. So that just shows you how out of touch the media is with the average person.